Okay, this is the third mini lecture to accompany Chapter 12, and this one focuses on how neurons send messages to other cells. They meet other cells at synapses, and primarily they do this by releasing a chemical messenger. Let's continue on. So, first, here, remember neurons, they're these nerve cells that can receive and transmit messages. They have a large cell body, a receptive surface called a dendrite, and a surface called an axon that will send messages away from the cell. These messages are in the form of action potentials, a change in the electrical charge or membrane potential of a neuron. And these occur when ion channels cycle through a quick open phase, and it allows sodium to go into the cell and quickly depolarize the cell. So it goes from being negative to then being slightly positive. This happens really quick, it's milliseconds, and it will spread across the entire surface of a neuron. But then, how does a neuron signal another cell? Well, that happens at the junction between neurons, and these junctions are called synapses. There's a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell. The presynaptic cell transmits a signal. The postsynaptic cell has to be able to receive the signal. And that signal has to cross a small gap. That's the synapse or synaptic cleft. And there's a couple ways cells do this. Some cells can electrically stimulate other cells, but the majority of neurons are going to send a message by sending a little chemical messenger. And so these are chemical synapses, and the messengers are neurotransmitter molecules. And it's the shape of the molecule that sends the message. So these neuron signals at chemical synapses, these happen at a presynaptic terminal where there's a slight enlargement of the axon. It's called a bulb, and that bulb will contain vesicles of stored neurotransmitters. Okay, those neurotransmitters can be released into the space between the neuron, and then the postsynaptic neuron has to have a receptor that binds specifically to that neurotransmitter molecule. And most commonly, these receptors are ligand-gated ion channels, and so they open up. And usually neurons are signaling other neurons, but they can signal muscle cells or glial cells, and usually that's going to cause those ion channels to open. So this action potential arrives, kind of goes down that axon, and it reaches the bulb. And at the bulb, it will cause the opening of calcium channels. Those voltage-gated calcium channels open. Calcium moves into the synaptic bulb. That causes changes in the cytoskeleton of the presynaptic cell, and that causes the movement of those synaptic vesicles. Then some of them will fuse with the membrane of the cell, and that releases the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter then enters the cleft, and by diffusion, the cleft is a very short distance. It'll cross that, and it'll be attracted to the charge and the shape of the receptor molecule. When it hits that receptor molecule, it temporarily binds, causing the ion channel to open. Okay, if those are ion channels for sodium, sodium will enter the cell, and the cell will depolarize and have an action potential. Okay, those types of neurotransmitters, or those receptors for neurotransmitters, are excitatory, and they will excite an action potential in the other cell. Sometimes, though, these ligand-gated channels will open ion channels for potassium, and then potassium will move down its concentration gradient out of the cell, and the cell becomes more negative. Okay, that hyperpolarizes the cell, and it's inhibitory. And those receptors are said to be inhibitory. Okay, and so there's lots of different neurotransmitters. They're really important molecules. They do lots of things. They are how our nerves signal our muscle cells, how they signal our our gland cells, how they signal other neurons. There's lots of important information about neurotransmitters, and we've already talked a little bit about acetylcholine, because acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that neurons use to signal muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells. And we've talked about a disorder, myasthenia gravis, where the receptors become less and less common. And so it gets harder and harder for the nerve cells to signal the muscle cells because there are fewer receptors. Okay, and so that's treated by possibly trying to increase the acetylcholine present and try and increase the number of receptors. But there's lots of different types of neurotransmitters. There's lots of cases where we want to alter their concentration or activity, and so there are commonly medicines are used to do that. But also sometimes drugs of abuse are drugs that alter neurotransmitters or their receptors. So I've got listed here antidepressants that affect serotonin. I've got talking about anxiety disorders, hallucinogens, various other types of things where neurotransmitters are particularly important. Look these over, but I'm not so much sure that you should know any other than the acetylcholine examples and maybe serotonin. But it's really important that you understand there's lots of neurotransmitters, and we'll talk about some of them later on. So finally, let's summarize again. The junction between two neurons is a synapse. There's a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell. The presynaptic cell has a synaptic knob that contains vesicles for neurotransmitters. The postsynaptic cell has receptors, usually linked to ion channels. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messenger molecules that are released. They move by diffusion. They bind to ligand-gated ion channels, and they can excite or inhibit cells depending on the types of receptors. Okay, medicine and recreational drugs affect neurotransmitters or receptors. Good example, nicotine binds to acetylcholine receptors. Many antidepressants affect serotonin levels by causing serotonin to linger longer in the synapse by blocking its uptake. Okay, we'll stop there. Look for a form that should appear midweek that will ask you for your input on a question related to what we've covered this week. Look for the quiz on this week's activities, and check the study guide to see what important vocabulary words and concepts you should know.